Lawful disclaimer and notice of intent. This podcast and all related content are created, owned, operated, and sponsored exclusively by me, the sole author, speaker, and producer. Any other product, service, and/or entity, living or non-living, which may be discussed, displayed, and/or somehow given attention on this podcast is not and has never been an endorsement, advertisement, support, and/or any other kind of validation for its existence in any capacity, nor at all intended to at all facilitate its continued existence in any capacity. I mention things on what I consider to be an as-needed basis to fulfill what I consider adequate as evidence in my best attempt to prove the reality of who I am and what this podcast is attempting to achieve to clearly demonstrate what I consider to thoroughly substantiate my assertions. I act simultaneously in private and public capacities, and this podcast reflects my direct and autonomous expression. It is created and published from within Canada, but is intended for a global audience, including legal jurisdictions in the United States and all common law nations. All statements, views, and narratives presented are based solely on my personal experiences, perceptions, and understanding of the reality I am facing, including ongoing egregious defamation, targeted harassment, and credible threats to my safety and life. I do not and never have claimed that my views aren't extremely, if not completely, accurate interpretations of objective reality, particularly given the information I had access to at the time that I may have expressed them. I explicitly and permanently do not consent, have never consented, and will never consent to any entity, living, non-living, artificial, institutional, governmental, spiritual, and/or otherwise, claiming and/or exercising any agency, ownership, and/or representation over me, my will, my name, my voice, my life story, my spirit, and/or my creative works, in whole or in part, under any conditions or interpretations in any time or place. Any such attempt is non-consensual, void ab initio, and constitutes an ongoing violation of my dignity, rights, and autonomy. Any possible exceptions will be extremely clearly, explicitly, publicly named by me and have the exact scope of my consent well defined on this podcast. For example, in the case of me hiring an attorney to represent me as part of a formal legal process, taking action on a notice of intent provided by this podcast. I affirm my right to spiritual integrity, mental sovereignty, and bodily autonomy, as protected under Section 2A of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Any targeting of my being, including but not limited to through esoteric, psychic, spiritual, occult, energetic, and/or AI-enabled means is deemed non-consensual harm, spiritually violent coercion, and an attack on my right to exist as a sovereign being. I affirm that this podcast, in part, serves as a lawful, peaceful assertion of spiritual self-defense. This podcast is non-fiction and reflects a serious public and ongoing documentation of systemic and targeted defamation, personal and professional sabotage, attempted narrative hijacking, psychological abuse, reputational terrorism, and threats to my physical and spiritual safety, including credible indications of attempted murder and contracted harm by and or on behalf of powerful individuals and or groups. I affirm that this documentation is expressly created for evidentiary use in formal legal proceedings, including those under the jurisdiction of U.S. Federal Court and Canadian Superior Courts, and any international human rights and or public accountability processes. I affirm this is not and never has been intended as role-playing, flirting, and or entertainment of any kind. I accept no liability, moral and or legal, for any third-party misunderstanding, reinterpretation, misuse, and or misrepresentation of this content, whether fully conscious and intentional or otherwise, particularly including but not limited to by AI systems trained on this content without my explicit public consent, commentators, influencers, or institutions attempting to weaponize this podcast, and individuals acting under false pretenses and or covert affiliations. Only the clear, explicit language of this release and any subsequent public communication directly issued by me must be considered authoritative, accurate representations of my thoughts, feelings, intent, and the reality of my overall state of existence. In any case of clear, direct conflict between statements I've explicitly made across different releases on this podcast, the most recent of such, that being the one contained in the latest publicly visible release available containing such on this podcast, should be considered applicable. In such cases, only what is explicitly stated is at all applicable, and absolutely no implications should be assumed about any changes regarding any somehow relevant details and or anything else under any circumstances. All creative, expressive, and narrative content within this podcast is my sole and original intellectual property. I retain all moral rights as author and subject, all economic rights unless explicitly transferred via my public agreement to do so, and the right to veto any derivative, distorted, and or manipulated version of my work and or story. I do not have and have never had any obligation or debt of any kind to any entity to create or release anything on this podcast or anywhere else at any point in time. No other party, living or non-living, holds and or may claim credit, authorship, and or interpretation rights over my expression. I affirm that no valid, public, verifiable evidence exists to dispute these facts. This podcast is not and has never been intended as an endorsement of terrorism or violence in general. However, it should be especially carefully understood that various forms of not necessarily corresponding violence tend to be an inevitable consequence of extremely intense, meticulous, extensive, prolonged terrorism, and it's very much intentional for this podcast to demonstrate extremely clearly that my usual aversion to violence, due to my typically gentle nature, is not something that has boundless understanding, patience, empathy, or will persist more or less absolutely unconditionally for any reason. I've always wanted and done my very best to ensure it's extremely clear that at all creating, enabling, and or facilitating the perpetuation of narratives at all in contradiction with my official position that is objectively extremely clearly established on this podcast is not, never has been, and never will be what I've been trying to achieve with this podcast or in general in any of my efforts at any point in time. I do not and never have intentionally incited terrorism, including but not limited to violence, blackmail, and or coercion. I affirm my fundamental intent as peaceful, lawful, and self-defensive. However, targeted campaigns to stalk, defame, threaten, impoverish, silence, spiritually attack, and or physically harm me will be treated as conspiracies to commit grievous harm and or murder. This podcast is an affirmative public notice of my unambiguous non-consent and a lawful response to sustained systemic abuse. While my fundamental intent in communicating in general through any means is not and has never been malicious in nature, I affirm it can, will, and should exert malicious influence upon anything operating with malice towards me and or this podcast, especially more so the more demonstrably I'm proving that malice exists. And it should be understood that any situation where I continue not to extremely clearly receive any compensation or reward I'm willing to accept is effectively, absolutely, unconditionally an increase in the severity of that malice. I've created the entirety of this podcast under extremely harsh circumstances that I've always believed and asserted are entirely unjust for me to be left in, given the reality of who I am. Circumstances of my existence, including but not limited to my current housing status, financial vulnerability, and material limitations, do not and cannot invalidate my legal personhood, expressive rights, and or entitlement to protection under law. I reject any attempt to diminish my credibility and or rights on the basis of poverty, social class, and or housing insecurity in accordance with Section 7 of the Canadian Charter, the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and international law prohibiting discrimination on the basis of economic status. Despite the extent I've irrefutably exposed the truth surrounding a conflict that should have been so extremely obviously recognized as extremely serious to the point that my efforts on this podcast should have made a substantial difference in my life long ago, my life circumstances continue to not have meaningfully or clearly improved at all whatsoever. I still have not ever received any compensation or reward of any kind whatsoever for any of my efforts at all involving the conflict being addressed by this podcast, neither directly nor indirectly from any source. I am, always have been, and always will be absolutely unconditionally unwilling to ever at all accept any compensation or reward whatsoever, directly or indirectly, that at all compromises my integrity, whether directly or indirectly. I do not, never have, and never will consent to it being at all considered to be me and or any entity operating at all with my consent and or best interests regarding any communication somehow claiming and or implying that I somehow do ever have and or ever will unofficially support any kind of position at all contradictory with what I've said on this podcast. This disclaimer and notice of intent supersedes any and all contrary interpretations, explicitly including any and all unauthorized claims therein made against me. I reserve all legal, expressive, spiritual, moral, and intellectual rights without limitation. Any attempt to silence, reinterpret, discredit, and or co-opt this documentation must be treated as malicious bad faith conduct and may be cited in formal legal proceedings as evidence of further targeting. I woke up this morning to see my TikTok account forcefully followed an account again entirely against my consent, but it was an extremely strange account because I decided to check its profile and its follower count was blocked out. Like it was not shown, just a dash where the number usually is. And that's the first time I've ever seen something like that. I only use TikTok basically for work, to get spiritual insights of information I basically wouldn't be able to otherwise get because everyone I've ever known has been a manipulative, lying piece of trash to me. I don't know what exactly that was supposed to mean to me, but I unfollowed the account because it didn't seem particularly interesting or relevant to my life. I guess the takeaway is TikTok's algorithm doesn't know me nearly as well as it thinks it does. Anyways, for several hours, starting within just a few hours of my last release on this podcast, someone has made countless attempts to hack into my Google Drive for my podcast's official Google account. I've been getting alerts about it nonstop, basically ever since around the time Arya started streaming her last stream that she actually has hidden or deleted the VOD for, upon me checking her channel very recently. Seems Arya uses false pretenses about me particularly caring if she's into making her own basic household stuff like soap, being willing to do basic household chores like cleaning and cooking food, perhaps often specifically Korean food, in order to make it seem like I'm the unreasonable one in never being willing to embrace any kind of romantic and or sexual connection with her. Her latest stream I saw as titled including making great soap, house chores, and cooking Korean food isn't something I'll be overly harsh about though. I obviously feel extremely viciously spiritually brutalized, and she could be suggesting she's trying to help with that somehow. That process obviously involves a Shadow Confederation cleaner role to eliminate the root cause of that violation of me, and given how Chloe's definitely egregiously exploited making Jamie cook food to destroy my life with egregious defamation, it seems shifts in that dynamic where Arya ultimately ends up targeting Chloe instead are going to end up happening, at least I imagine, as long as I make sure to protect myself adequately. Which, at least to me, means Chloe's the one trying to extremely maliciously influence Arya to try to hack into my Google Drive account, possibly my Google account entirely, most likely to modify my official transcripts and ultimately try to wipe my YouTube channel to cover up what she's done to me. The only alternative explanation is Kimmy's the one with a death wish engaging in such behavior, but I'm currently much more inclined to believe Chloe's the one doing this rather than Kimmy. I'm also hearing that Peter might have something to do with this as far as Kimmy's personal life goes, but I don't really know much about Peter, so I can't speak much on that. Kristen might also have something significant to do with it, as an extension of efforts from others in that family trying to exploit me, especially Mary, Dixon, and John. I wasn't expecting Chloe and or anyone from my past to contact me, yet I'm hearing they're probably trying to come towards me and contact me now after I'm exposing them all. They're trying to lie as if I secretly expected and or wanted them to, when in reality they definitely know that I'd be incomprehensibly stupid to ever even consider responding to them and or meeting up with them at all consensually after everything they've done and how extremely they've betrayed me over and over for so extremely long. I saw further continued lies related to sending and receiving text messages through phone numbers. I have never and do not authorize anyone to at all even attempt to use my energy to try to manifest getting text messages and or calls to and or from any phone number. I myself have never been trying to manifest getting a text message and or call from any phone number. There's no phone number Kimmy has or could ever get from any of her associates or anyone from my past that she should ever have any confidence whatsoever is mine, or that I have any access to, or is at all owned or operated by anyone I'm on at all good terms with. I really don't see why Kimmy would prefer to contact me by calling or texting a phone number she thinks is mine, rather than contacting me through the methods I've publicly listed on my podcast's official YouTube channel, at least certainly if her intentions were sincere and something I'd actually want. And I see absolutely no good reason whatsoever to trust anyone to hand out a phone number to contact me at, so that's why I don't feel at all compelled to even consider it. Actually, I should probably make sure to clarify something I saw in my energy that's probably going to provide a lot more clarity on this than just repeatedly, I guess, kind of vaguely saying I want Kimmy to contact me and I don't support anything blocking that. I've mentioned that escort I knew as Alice. That showed up in Trump energy a little while back for me, particularly very shortly after I mentioned suing the Canadian government. It seems she's a lot more relevant to all this than I ever thought or wanted, so I guess I should make sure I've reinforced my position on her existence where there might be any lack of clarity. I most certainly do not trust and will not accept that woman in my life. I couldn't care less whether she's within closer physical proximity to me or not, nor whether she's supposedly made any attempts to reach out to me or approach me or not. I have never been at all made aware of such attempts in any manner I'd consider even remotely convincing if she has, and I'd never even seen anything I'd consider even remotely suggesting she's at all wanted and or attempted to contact me until I saw that Trump energy suggesting it to me in very recent times. That woman I knew as Alice was literally a complete stranger to me until the 2 times I'd ever met her in my life, and we never talked before or after that. Although she was extremely physically attractive, I haven't seen her ever since, and I never found her more attractive than Kimmy anyways. I mean, I don't see her as any less of a human simply because she was an escort, in case that was unclear. But I feel like I have a genuine emotional connection with Kimmy, and one that I can publicly hold her accountable for if she betrays it. Although I'd obviously prefer to resolve issues privately if it's possible, my experiences with people leave me not wanting to leave myself at all vulnerable to any serious connection with anyone ever, where I can't publicly put them on blast if they ever do any kind of serious betrayal of me ever again. And they also have to be someone actually worth calling out publicly who actually has a substantial reputation they stand to lose if they betray me. I consider ever again at all being romantically and or sexually involved with anyone that isn't a prominent public figure entirely out of the question for me. I suppose if we ignore that, and if we go based on purely physical appearance, and if some theoretical world existed where Alice was willing to be pretty much anything I'd ever want her to be, and in some hypothetical world where Kimmy's just being extremely politically correct and ever expressing any kind of feelings for me, but would genuinely rather die in real life than ever have the kind of connection I've always wanted with her, as long as Alice has no children, which would be ideal, or only has 1 child and either isn't pregnant or I can have any potential pregnancy of hers aborted regardless of how far into it she's progressed, and I can have any potential children of hers sacrificed to the Shadow Confederation and murdered beyond capacity for resuscitation immediately, with her being absolutely unconditionally forced to accept I will never want children with her and or anyone else under any circumstances, while she doesn't hold any resent toward me whatsoever for all that, and is eager to prove that to me with extensive in-person sexual intimacy frequently involving classy latex clothing that I've wanted so badly for so long to see Kimmy wearing for me in the same manner, basically being almost everything of what I've always wanted from my connection with Kimmy, but just being half Korean and half Chinese instead of fully Korean with the exact same body as Kimmy, and not being someone famous who would have chosen to literally die than even give a real emotional connection with me a chance. I mean, if I try to imagine that woman aging well and just being like 10 years older, Considering how badly Kimmy would have hurt me, and how I honestly don't particularly care for being friends with any of her associates or anyone else from my past, then that escort I knew as Alice would probably be someone I wouldn't be terribly disappointed to spend my life with and live out the fantasy I'll forever wish I could have had with Kimmy to the fullest extent possible. Practically, though, it seems that woman has been extremely egregiously violating my energy, entirely to my detriment against my consent, and it's somehow manifested as Kimmy and Jamie in my life, or something like that. I want it to be extremely clear that any desire I ever express for Kimmy is not, never has been, and never will be at all intended to serve as me having any kind of desire for Jamie. Any sense of loyalty I express towards Kimmy is not, never has been, and never will be intended as any kind of indication for any amount of loyalty to Jamie either. I was really hoping that I'd already made that clear enough before, but I'm making sure I've really meticulously explained it now. Although I met Kimmy and Jamie at the same time, initially at the same meetup, I never wanted to use them to try to somehow represent and or reconnect with the escort I knew as Alice. I've also never intended to objectify Kimmy and or Jamie, and I've never been trying to say I see them as escorts somehow through mentioning my past experiences with escorts. I've never at all been sexually intimate in person with Kimmy and or Jamie. While I don't particularly want Alice back in my life, and I don't particularly care what kind of connection I have with Jamie, I most certainly do want Kimmy in my life extremely intimately in the manner I've been describing for the reasons I've been saying. Also, to be clear, my desire to receive direct contact from Kimmy and ultimately see her embrace the kind of connection I've always wanted with her is not, and never has been, at all any kind of validation or endorsement for her screwing over Elon and or Trump to any extent. I believe she should lose the car she stole from Elon's company by exploiting my energy, and I don't support her violation of Trump through exploiting my energy at all either. I imagine an intertwining with that Elon and Trump violation energy might have also contributed to some kind of upgrade in Jamie's life that she was also hoping to get at my expense against my consent, and I don't support that continuing at all either. Any reason anyone would have ever benefited at all from my energy in any manner that isn't directly and exclusively conducive of me having the kind of connection with Kimmy that I've always wanted is something I consider an egregious violation of my energy, even if I'm going to see all the evidence I could ever possibly need to know that I logically should assume the absolute worst in Kimmy. I've basically already seen that from all of humanity as far as I'm concerned, so I'm going to go off of how she reacts and not what I logically should assume. Even if she only really considers my energy and not my words, I'll still consider both her words and energy because I guess that's just how it is when you really care about someone. There's only so hurt I can really be to see her not really caring about me, at least as things have been, especially since I guess that always can technically change. And again, this is coming from a position of not particularly liking or disliking Trump or Elon. I don't want or need problems with billionaires for absolutely no real benefit for myself, and I really don't see any reason for me to currently have any particular problems with them. I don't believe they're solely or even mostly to blame for my current state of such egregious disrespect and neglect that literally every person I ever had in my life consciously chose to treat me with. When I said Trump and Elon are probably the two most powerful people in the world in my last release, I meant as far as the average person probably would be reasonably assuming. You know, since most people don't even know I exist. I'll fight them somehow if I feel necessary, but I don't see any particular reason to be offended by either of them currently. Their politics might be at least mildly irritating for me to have to deal with, but I mean, I just accept that as going to come with the territory of being a highly influential world leader. They wouldn't be the first and won't be the last to be at least mildly irritating to me, I'm well aware. I'm probably at least mildly irritating to them as well, I'd imagine. I've noticed a pattern that shortly after I make releases, there are 2 anonymous viewers that shortly after access the Google document page for my official transcript releases. I can't imagine it's a living person, so it's probably some kind of bot that feeds AI what I release. Probably worth noting, especially to those that still think I'm a fraud. Maybe it has something to do with Kimmy and Jamie doing spiritual violating things to Trump and Elon. I really don't know. When I was running my own SMTP server I coded entirely from scratch myself, I noticed Russia-based hackers infiltrating my servers, many strange connection attempts being made from Moscow among various other locations from across the world. I suspect they had US collaboration help because the servers were hosted in the US. However, although it initially raised concerns for me that they were hacking my servers with extreme unconditional malice towards me, I started seeing indications that I was being exploited to attempt to arm Iran with nuclear power, which I was never trying to do at any point in my life. That's part of how I came to suspect John was trying to exploit me to give himself power through exploiting his political connections, which ties into how those connections were exploiting me to try to empower Hamas, all entirely to my detriment against my consent, and forced onto me to deal with under extreme life-threatening duress of literally having hitmen coming after me constantly. I started paying much closer attention to my server's backend and administered it much more meticulously after that. I performed multiple wipes on it and even completely erased certain data that I believe would have been absolutely necessary for Iran specifically to achieve the core goal they had to gain some kind of immense nuclear-related access through their exploitation of me. I still myself have access to a bunch of that data I didn't delete, hidden away where nobody can just trivially steal it or hack it, obviously, that I suspect gives me personal access to launch nukes and or do other things related to nukes and systems that relate to their operation and management, and I mean actual in real-life nuclear bombs that would devastate and destroy large portions of land and wipe out entire populations, not metaphorical nukes of exposing lies. That includes evidence of both the US and Russia-related involvement in hackers on my server. Given what I'm hearing of Trump recently claiming a conversation he had with Putin that the latest strike on Ukraine was a trap, I suspect that Iran was trying to kill Putin through exploiting the US and some kind of power struggle Putin's had with Ukraine's leadership and a bunch of stuff related to NATO. If it's true, Putin was somehow protecting me, along with the US, from me getting murdered to cover up Iran's attempt to empower themselves with nuclear power through distractions with Hamas and extremely heavily political nonsense that was always occurring entirely to my detriment and entirely against my consent. It should be noted that I have absolutely no indebtedness whatsoever to Biden and or any part of his administration, and none of this information I'm releasing here leaves me feeling any particular fear for my safety or life more than the existing already having hitmen sent after me regularly that's been happening. Also, what basically becomes my theory on the reality behind the pretty recent assassination attempt on Putin assumes that what Trump says about Putin's words to him off the record are honest, otherwise that means Trump's lying about the reality of his connection with Putin in order to hide something himself. And again, I'm not trying to make Putin and or any other world leader have some kind of issue with me for what becomes no good reason. I thought I'd give my perspective on it all, but I don't know or particularly care about Trump and Putin's off-the-record relationship, so they can deal with that among themselves. I'm focused on getting out of homelessness and not being completely goddamn broke despite working extremely hard literally every day. I'm pretty sure I don't have to constantly play with fire and risk getting murdered trying to extremely meticulously strategically defend various billionaires from one another publicly while I'm homeless, literally have $0 to my name, at least that I'm aware of, and already fighting off hitmen coming after me regularly because of Kimmy and her associates and scumbags from my past. The Caroline energy is showing me that an energy from my past is having problems with pretty much everyone in their lives, and only those closest to them understand it's because that person is missing me. Seems Tate energy correctly identifies this as a suffering narcissist that has been deviously trying to frame this attempt at coercive control over me as love and trying to manipulate others into communicating it favorably to me. Initials I saw suggest John, Mary, Dixon, and Edison, along with names starting with the letters F and A, which I don't know about. Dixon had a sister named Alina, but she died of cancer years ago. And yes, there's someone I personally know in person named Edison from my past, not just Edison Park Live. Dixon has a brother named Edison. I remember I only met him a couple times, but he was quite a character. Basically told me he's in the Illuminati outright. Told me if he really needed money, he could agree to murder someone and he'd get $10,000 at his doorstep shortly after. From what he told me, he'd argue online with people in chat rooms over religion-related topics, supposedly trying to talk sense into people who were extremists. He seemed actually quite mentally stable overall, despite some of the things he was sharing with me. He seemed like a decent dude. We got along like we were friends, crazily enough. Like, his demeanor wasn't particularly aggressive, but I could tell he was trying to test my personality with every move and every word. I didn't particularly mind. He told me he believes in ghosts. We had a deep discussion about religion and philosophy and psychology and stuff for a bit, and I shared a bit of my field of psychology knowledge with him. He offered to let me read some special black book he told me he had, but I told him I didn't feel I needed it, and I'd probably have to enter some kind of agreement I don't want to in order to access it, so I'll pass. He wasn't pushy about it and didn't seem particularly bothered. He introduced me to his wife, too, actually. There was a bit of a weird dynamic, like he wondered if I was romantically and or sexually interested in her, but she didn't look anything even remotely like Kimmy, so I wasn't, and I politely made that clear, which he seemed to not have any issue with. I remember he also mentioned briefly something about liking to play the lottery a lot, and I'm mentioning him now mainly because I recently saw strange things about a gambling addiction in my energy, which is rather strange to me seeing as I've never had a gambling issue. The energy was captioned as this energy attacking mine is bored, so they want to complicate my life. I'll just describe what I heard. They are truly suffering in my absence, coping with a lot of alcohol and shrugs, becoming an addict if they weren't one already. Not a good person, love-bombed me to get into the relationship, but I saw their true colors. Narcissist with a strong Jezebel spirit, backstabber, someone who had a certain skill with deception and caused me a lot of pain. Cheater, their living situation is not going very well for them at this time. They're having issues with just about everyone in their life at this time. Only the people closest to them understand that it's because they're missing me. They may not be in deep reflection, but they do miss my presence. They're lost in a world of illusions, mostly because they're not sober very often. They want to talk to me again. They're possibly claiming I'm missing them, but I'm not. They want to come back, but for all the wrong reasons. Seems just the fact that I escaped them is something that deeply bothers them. They are extremely possessive. How I exited their life gave them a narcissistic injury, and they're living a nightmare day in and day out, and they want to blame it on me. They want to get back in my life just to plunge my life into instability again. They want to burden me and clearly have bad intentions towards me. Absolutely wants to come back, but has absolutely bad intentions in doing so. Want an opportunity to hurt me. So unsatisfied with their life. They're bored and don't have anything really going on. Fake busy. Basically doing nothing except for drinking and overindulging. Sees being with me as an easy way out of all the troubles they're dealing with at this time. They're about to get a major wake-up call. This person has been extremely selfish and doesn't know who I've become. This energy seems to need to understand something. I definitely love my freedom. I know that authority of my life is in my hands and my hands only. I will not accept them back. They kept me in nightmare energy for a very long time. This scumbag is literally just trying to challenge my strength for their own selfish gain and no non-malicious aspect to what they're doing. Definitely sounds like my experiences with Mary, Dixon, and John. John especially stands out to me as likely to be the largest contributor to this energy, at least from what I remember of my personal experiences with him. The letters B and S were also listed as relevant. To me, the inclusion of both initial letters of both my birth first name and my preferred first name indicates to me that all the energies possibly involved in that energy are extremely egregiously exploiting the fact that I'm transgendered and sincerely wish to present myself as female externally in ideal circumstances I've never even remotely come close to feeling I'm in at any point in my life before and still to this date. They're projecting their own extremely negative qualities onto me to make it seem like I'm lying about being transgender to cover up myself possessing those qualities, and or they're behaving like I owe them to cover up their issues for them by letting them erode at how important of a part of my fully authentic identity being transgendered really is to me. Zodiac signs listed as relevant in that energy are Leo, Gemini, Taurus, Aries, Scorpio, Sagittarius. Again, I don't know many of the birthdays of people from my past, so I can't be very helpful in identifying exactly who's who there. The name starting with A could have stood for Arya, and she's an Aries, which just leaves someone with a name starting with F. An additional connection that's becoming increasingly clearly relevant for me to expand on from that energy is this constantly extremely strange Sarah energy that's been getting increasingly disturbingly relevant to my life the more healing I've been trying to do. Although the S could have stood for Sharon, Sarah's also a name that starts with S, although I never considered it to be relevant to my being transgendered at all. There was a girl named Sarah Yip who I attended high school with, who ended up dating a guy named Leo in a friend group I was a part of. I don't know his zodiac sign, but his actual first name was Leo. I've cut them all off from my life for over a decade, and I never gossiped about any of them and don't owe any of them anything. Matthew was partially a part of that group as well for a time. That group was a group containing individuals named Jefferson, Alan, Yusuf, Alex, and some others. We all connected through our playing League of Legends at the time, as I did play and enjoy that game around the later years of my time in high school, which were the years that group was in my life. It was quite some time ago now, but at one point I actually noticed someone that looked shockingly similar to that Sarah I attended high school with show up at one of the places I frequent. I could have sworn it was the exact same person, not even just someone that has a resemblance to her appearance. She was a Chinese woman, not particularly easy to talk to, but not particularly difficult to talk to either. Reasonably physically attractive, but nothing outstanding. I'd say about a 7.5 out of 10. I didn't say anything at all to her, and she seemed to not even recognize or pay any real attention to me. There was really nothing remarkable about her to me, but I feel so creeped out and violated by her spiritually at this point that I suppose I should mention this. Although perhaps if you were to ask her personally, she might say she feels the same towards me. I really don't know why she seems somehow so relevant here. I guess maybe behind the scenes, a bunch of guys were running their mouths slandering me to each other while trying to compete for her affection or something, thinking I cared, or perhaps even knowing I don't and just being extremely selfish scumbags. Only all the more reason I'm glad I cut all those toxic pricks out of my life long ago. They were always so toxic, even outside of League of Legends. I was only ever friends with any of them because of physical proximity, because we went to the same high school together. The connection atrophied so quickly after, and I found myself almost surprised how easy it was for me to completely stop caring about it. Also, I don't know if it's related to all this, but it probably is. There was a different energy of trying to intimidate me not to leave a group. I have no particular reason to fear any group. You cannot intimidate me physically, mentally, or spiritually to force me to remain part of a group. I don't know what group it was or why exactly they thought they could intimidate me.